And I welcome everyone to PressTV's news review program, where we get in depth in one of the day's top stories. Iran says it is determined to make every effort to restore the 2015 deal as it is. Tehran has, however, reiterated the need for the provision of verifiable guarantees that the parties, that is, will not violate their obligations again.
When such customary and very fundamental principle of international law is mocked, trampled upon, and violated, no nation trusts the culprit, and so do we. Therefore, provision of verifiable and objective guarantees that the delicate balance of commitments will not be torpedoed anymore, the obligations will not be violated again, sanctions will not be reimposed under other pretexts or designations, as took place during the previous administration of the United States, and the JCPOA mechanisms will not be abused, is absolutely necessary.
During the UN Security Council session on the implementation of Resolution 2231, Iran's ambassador said the U.S. sanctions breach its legal obligations, the UN Charter, and international law. Majid Takhtarawchi noted that Washington's actions against his country amount to economic terrorism. He said Iran continues its remedial measures while the Vienna talks are underway because non-performance of obligations by other parties continues. Takhtarawchi stressed Iran has exercised maximum restraint and paid a heavy price to preserve the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And now joining us for the program is Jason Unruhe, political commentator from Ontario, and Edward Corrigan, international human rights lawyer, also from Ontario, Canada. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program here. Mr. Corrigan, we'll start with you. Hope you're safe and sound out there. Your initial thoughts by the Iranian envoy's statements there, and the fact that this was a Security Council session. We heard more countries imploring the U.S. to basically lambasting the U.S. for getting out of the JCPOA and imploring it to get back into it, more so than we heard them about basically trying to encourage Iran to get back under its commitments where it was back in May of 2018. Your initial thoughts on this?
Well, what we have is sort of a conflict of laws here. And unfortunately, the United States has a long tradition of not considering itself subject to foreign treaties and foreign laws or international law itself. So if someone like Trump comes to power, he, ripped up the JCPOA, but he also withdrew from a number of other important treaties, and he really treats them with contempt, even though some of these treaties have been in existence for many, many years and were part of keeping, of the world peaceful and to avoid any nuclear war. But Trump he's almost pathological in that he wants to be independent, push people around, and he is a bully. The Security Council, it's not a formal resolution, but the Security Council did approve the JCPOA agreement between the United States, Britain, France, Germany, the EU, China, and Russia. So it's almost like on the verge of binding international law. But the Americans say we're not bound by it. And if somebody like Trump comes in, but even there's a strong current in the Republican Party, maybe even a few Democrats, that say that they're not obligated and bound by treaties, and they're not bound by international law, and they're not bound by United Nations Security Council. And of course, the United States ultimately has a veto power to kill any resolutions at the Security Council, but the Obama administration supported the Security Council sort of endorsement of the JCPOA. Iran has abided by the agreements. The Americans have ripped it up and imposed as many hard sanctions as they can. The Europeans are equivocating. They're not really taking their responsibility, but they're not, and they're not honoring their obligations under the JCPOA. But Iran does have the right under Article 26 and 36 to respond in the JCPOA in ways if the other parties are not, honoring their obligations. And the Americans have destroyed and blown up that bridge, but the Europeans really haven't honored the obligation too. There's only been, baby steps forward. So what Iran wants is they want independence. They want, to be able to operate their economy free without sanctions. And they have said they're not interested in producing nuclear weapons. Ayatollah Khomeini said that. He made a threat about it. And, the Iranians have repeatedly said we're not interested in it. And the International Atomic Energy Commission has never found any evidence to say that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. But saying that doesn't mean that there's nothing in the JCPOA talks about, Iranian satellites or missiles or other weapons of defense. And while the Europeans and the Israelis want Iran to be under their control and subject to their power, they don't like it that Iran is strong enough to be a regional power and to defend itself. And that's really what the crux of this matter is. And of course, we saw what happened with Libya and Iraq and Serbia when they couldn't defend themselves. These countries ended up being destroyed. It's only Iran, which has capabilities that allow it to defend itself, and North Korea that have avoided this terrible problem. So Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, who cooperated, they paid the ultimate price.
Thank you, Mr. Corrigan. And Jason Unruhe, I'd like to welcome you to the program. Jason, I hope you're doing well. Now, Jason, the Russian envoy said something really interesting. He said the JCPOA for the world was a standard for the international community that showed that adversaries can get together, put their mind together, reduce tensions through dialogue, and achieve something. That it's a shame that it was basically scrapped by the U.S. unilaterally, but that it's that imperative to get back on, get it revived again and get it back on the table. And he said, basically, it's in Washington has the obligation to make this happen. It was a standard that we need to preserve. Why do we not get the same sense of urgency? Oh, also, he couldn't understand why he took the Biden administration, which was completely opposed Joe Biden and the Democrats, Donald Trump's withdrawal in May of 2018. Why it took him 6 months just to get back, just to get around to it when it was something this important between so many different players?
Well, I think that the main reason is because they don't actually care what happens to Iran, in that they do not care about the suffering that occurs as a result. The blocking of medical supplies, etc., particularly during the time of COVID, is something that they would secretly, if not openly, enjoy because it harms the ability of Iran to be able to function. And as your previous guest said, that is what this has always been about. It has always been about destabilizing and destroying Iran, or trying to force a regime change situation or something like that, or at least enough to foment some unrest and cause some major destabilization. But the fact is that the United States does not care about the Iranian people whatsoever. But frankly, I think that that's why it's been pushed so far down on the priorities list. I think that they've got a lot to deal with in terms of what happened with the ex-president on the day of the inauguration vote, or the confirmation of the vote, etc. But I do kind of find the statements by the Russian envoy to be very strange, considering that this agreement doesn't need to exist at all. This agreement only exists because the United States decided to try to force it on Iran for a nuclear weapons program that it doesn't have. I mean, yes, it's in the U.S.'s interest to get to the negotiation table, act in a reasonable way, act honorably, etc. But I think that sometimes it gets forgotten that this whole deal shouldn't even exist to begin with, because none of these sanctions should be on, period, because Iran had not made any wrongful moves to determine them, to deserve them to begin with. So I think that we do need to keep in mind the whole fraudulent basis for this entire JCPOA is something essentially being a force on Iran, because realistically there's not very much that they can do, so they have to go along with it. They go along with the rules, they do everything that they're supposed to do, they act completely honorably, and they still get this treatment by the United States, where the Israelis come out with a whole display wall full of fraudulent evidence of a nuclear program. They point to a carpet cleaning place, claim it's a secret nuclear facility. So I think that really shows that the whole thing is built on dishonesty. The whole thing is built deliberately just to hurt Iran, and it's something that unfortunately they have to keep going with. And the fact that the United States keeps going on with this and not releasing the sanctions that they're supposed to, getting rid of all of them, really, which aren't supposed to be there, even going far back as Trump. It shows that they're not really interested in trying to make something work. They're only interested in trying to hurt Iran.
We only have about 40 seconds left. Thank you, Jason. And Mr. Corrigan, I'm going to allow you to get the last word in. So to Jason's point, UX maximum pressure campaign against Iran for the U.S. itself pulling out of the JCPOA, which was imposed on Iran. I'm glad Jason mentioned, for a program it never had, which is very ironic. And due to that maximum pressure, livelihoods have been compromised, lives have been lost. Majid Takhtarovich, the UN envoy, alluded to that. We can't bring these people back. So why is the U.S. still demanding to try to push all the blame with the Europeans on Iran for the revival, when it should be the U.S. showing the sense of urgency, and basically it should be the one to shoulder the obligation of getting back into this thing?
Well, if you look at the history, the United States was involved with the overthrowing of the democratic elected government in Iran back in, I think it was 1953, the Mossadegh, and then they reinstalled the Shah of Iran, who was the son of the previous Shah, who was overthrown by the British and the Russians. So the Shah basically was an American puppet and was their so-called policeman for the Gulf. And also the American embassy in Tehran was actually the largest CIA station in the world, and it was intimately involved with keeping the Shah in power, identifying potential enemies, killing them, teaching them how to do torture, a lot of horrible things. And this hasn't come out much, but the Iranians know this, and when they took over the embassy, they got access to tons of documents. But the Americans, are still embarrassed and hurting from that episode, which occurred back in 1979. So there's a long-standing animosity, but it's not that, Iran doesn't bow to the whim of the Americans, doesn't do what they're told, and it doesn't bow to the Israelis. And that's the problem. They don't want an independent state. They rather have, compliant, sycophantic states, or states that are just, subservient to them, like Saudi Arabia, like United Arab Emirates and other countries. And Iran wants to be an independent country in its long history and tradition. And, that's the way the world should operate, not under the dictates of Americans.
Gentlemen, thank you both. Pardon to cut you off there, Edward, but we are out of time. Jason Unruhe, political commentator, joining us there from Ontario, Canada, and Edward Corrigan, international human rights lawyer, also joining us from Ontario. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.